Welcome, everyone. Before we really jump into the material today, I just want to take a quick second to extend a really warm, sincere welcome to you, our listener.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, wherever you are right now, whatever you happen to be doing, I pray that God abundantly blesses your day.
Mm-hmm.
I really pray He gives you deep peace, sharp clarity, and that you just experience His profound favor and grace throughout your entire week ahead. It's an absolute joy to have you here with us on this deep dive.
It really is a privilege. Thank you so much for, making us a part of your day.
Definitely. So imagine opening up this ancient legal code, right?
Uh,
And finding a detailed breakdown of exactly how much you have to pay your neighbor if, like, your cow gores their servant.
Right.
Or, precisely what happens if an employer knocks out their employee's tooth.
Yeah, it gets incredibly specific.
It does. Today, we're opening up a 3,000-year-old document that sounds shockingly like a modern workers' compensation claim, just sort of mixed with a really complex liability textbook.
It's fascinating.
We are looking at the book of Exodus, specifically chapter 21. And to guide us, we've got the historical and textual insights from two incredibly detailed sources, the Holman and the NAA Study Bibles.
Yeah, and just to be super clear up front, our mission here is to look at this text completely impartially.
Right, purely as a historical document.
Exactly. When we examine these verses, we're not taking political or theological sides. We're just looking at the underlying logic, the mechanics of how this specific agrarian society functioned and the values they were trying to actually codify into law.
Because what you find in this chapter, it really reveals an ancient civilization dealing with complex issues that we are literally still wrestling with today.
Oh, absolutely.
We're talking human rights, medical compensation, the precise legal threshold for gross negligence. So, to kick things off, let's jump into the first 11 verses.
Okay.
Because they tackle what is honestly one of the most jarring topics for modern readers approaching this text, the ancient laws of servitude and debt.
Yeah, it is invariably a stumbling block for people.
Oh, for sure.
Because when modern readers see the word servant or slave in an ancient text, historical alarms immediately go off. And I mean, rightfully so.
Yeah, we can't help it.
Right. We read those words entirely through the lens of the horrific chattel slavery of the last few centuries.
But, as I read through the notes from our sources, I started looking at the mechanism described here, less like that modern historical trauma and more like, well, kind of like a harsh, highly regulated form of ancient bankruptcy.
Okay, yeah.
Or like a debt consolidation program, because the text says a Hebrew servant works for 6 years, and then in the 7th year, he goes free.
Fully free.
Right, owing absolutely nothing. And what really caught my attention in the NAA Study Bible notes is that the 6-year cycle isn't just arbitrary.
No, not at all.
It actually mirrors the rhythm of the creation narrative.
Right.
6 days of work, 1 day of rest.
And that is such a crucial mechanism to understand here. By embedding this theological rhythm into an economic law, this society was basically changing how they viewed human labor. Well, think about the wider ancient Near East at the time.
Mm-hmm.
If you lost your land or fell into massive debt because of a famine or something, there was no government safety net.
Right, no unemployment checks.
Exactly. No food stamps, nothing. So selling your labor, and effectively yourself, to a wealthier household was just a desperate survival strategy to avoid starvation.
Wow, okay.
But by linking the end of that servitude to the creation week, the law dictates that liberation and rest aren't just like contractual perks you negotiate.
Right.
They are a divine right built into the actual fabric of time itself.
That's really profound. But okay, let's unpack this a bit because I have to push back on a specific rule here that completely stopped me in my tracks.
Okay, let's hear it.
The text states that if the master provides the servant with a wife, and they have children during those 6 years when that 7th year arrives and the servant goes free,
Yeah.
the wife and the kids stay with the master. The man literally leaves alone.
Right, I know.
I mean, I don't care what era you live in. Separating a family sounds incredibly harsh to modern ears. How does the historical context possibly make sense of that logic?
It does sound incredibly cruel to us. Mostly because we view marriage and family primarily through this emotional, highly individualistic lens.
Sure.
But we have to look at the strict economic reality of that agrarian society. The master provided the wife, meaning she was likely another servant in his household.
Okay.
Someone whose labor he had already purchased or whose upkeep he was completely responsible for. And the children born to her were legally and practically considered part of the master's household economy.
Now she was paying for them.
Exactly. He bore the burden of feeding, sheltering, and protecting them.
Ah, I see.
Now, think about the departing servant. He is walking out the door on day 1 of year 7 with 0 assets, no land, no crops.
He literally couldn't afford to keep them alive?
Precisely. The law basically prioritizes the physical survival of the vulnerable woman and her children over the cohesion of the family unit.
Okay, that makes it make a lot more sense. But the text does offer an alternative, right? And it's a really sensory, memorable one, the ear-piercing ritual.
Oh, yes. The all.
Yeah. If the departing servant says, you know what, I love my master, I love my wife and my children, I don't want to go free, they do something that sounds really intense.
Very intense.
The master brings him to the doorpost of the house and physically pierces his ear with an awl.
Yeah, and the symbolism there is just profound.
Why the ear, specifically?
Well, the ear represented obedience, right?
Mm.
Hearing the master's voice.
Mm-hmm.
And why the doorpost?
Yeah, why not a tree or something?
Because the doorpost is the literal physical boundary separating the chaotic, unpredictable outside world from the security and provision of that specific household.
Oh, wow.
So by pinning the ear to the doorpost, it's this permanent physical metaphor anchoring the servant's identity to that home.
That's fascinating.
It transforms what was originally a temporary economic necessity into a permanent voluntary attachment, one driven by love and a desire for familial security.
And, our sources highlight that this legal code wasn't just about managing male laborers. There are some incredibly specific protections for vulnerable women in this text, too.
Yes, very much so.
The Holman Study Bible brings up the historical context of families being so destitute that they literally had to sell their daughters.
It's a hard reality to think about.
It really is. And to make sense of this, they reference the story of Hagar in Genesis.
Right, the foreign servant.
Exactly. She was essentially used as a surrogate by Abraham and Sarah and then completely cast out into the desert when she was no longer wanted. But this new law in Exodus specifically prevents that kind of human discard.
That is exactly where the law becomes remarkably pragmatic and honestly very protective for its era.
How so?
Well, if a wealthy man bought a female servant to be a secondary wife, but she didn't please him, he couldn't just throw her out on the street.
Right.
And he definitely couldn't sell her for a profit to a foreign people.
Right.
So it's explicitly forbidden because it would strip her of all her societal protections.
So what did he have to do?
He had to allow her family the right to redeem her, to buy her back.
And it goes even further than that. Because if the master takes another wife later on, the text explicitly says he cannot diminish the first woman's food, her clothing, or her marital rights.
Yes.
And if he fails to provide those 3 basic necessities, she walks away completely free.
Just walks away.
No money exchange, nothing. She just gets to leave.
And if we look at the anthropological landscape of the ancient Near East, that level of legal protection for a woman of the lowest possible social status was virtually non-existent.
It's unheard of.
Completely. It prevented pure exploitation. It essentially codified the idea that, hey, even if you bought her labor and took her as a wife, you do not own her humanity.
Right.
You have undeniable binding obligations to her well-being.
So we see here that even in this highly regulated economic contract, the ancient law drew a hard line at the master's power over the human body.
Exactly.
But, and this is a big but, what happens when that bodily autonomy is violated entirely outside of a contract? When the violence isn't economic, but physical. And that naturally brings us to verses 12 through 27, which cover a huge spectrum of physical violence.
Oh, yeah. It covers everything from, premeditated murder to just a spontaneous neighborhood fistfight.
And this is where it felt like I was reading the protocols of a prehistoric HR department.
Right.
There's this one scenario where 2 guys get into a brawl. One hits the other with a rock or his fist. The injured guy doesn't die, but he's confined to his bed. The law says that if he recovers enough to just walk outside with his staff, the guy who hit him is cleared of lethal charges. But, and this is a massive but, the striker has to pay the injured man for his lost time.
Yeah.
And he has to pay for his medical care until he is completely healed.
Exactly. It's literally an ancient mechanism for calculating the actuarial value of lost labor, right alongside medical liability.
It's amazing.
It demands that the aggressor fully restore the victim's economic stability.
Yeah. But then the text shifts to lethal violence, and it introduces this concept of asylum. And I think this really highlights the underlying worldview of the text regarding justice.
It does. It draws a razor-sharp distinction between an accidental death and premeditated murder.
Right.
The NAA Study Bible notes point out that God says He will appoint a place for the accidental killer to flee to.
The cities of refuge.
Exactly. This is the seed for what would later become the cities of refuge in ancient Israel. If it was a genuine accident, like, say, an axe head just flies off the handle and strikes someone,
A total freak accident.
right, you were given a sanctuary to protect you from the immediate, emotional, blood-feud vengeance of the victim's family.
But premeditated murder is treated completely differently. The Holman notes highlight a really powerful phrase here. If someone schemes and kills intentionally, the law dictates that you must take him away from God's altar to be put to death.
Yeah, that's a huge shift.
It's like a primitive form of diplomatic immunity just being revoked. Because in a lot of other ancient cultures, a temple or an altar was like a sovereign embassy, right? Where the local authorities couldn't touch you. If you touched the altar, you were safe, regardless of what you actually did.
Right, the altar was often treated as this magical get-out-of-jail-free card.
Yeah.
But this text strips that immunity away entirely. It makes a profound theological statement. God's altar cannot be manipulated by the wicked to escape justice.
That's a great way to put it.
The sacredness of the religious space simply does not override the societal demand for moral accountability.
Which perfectly sets up perhaps the most famous, and I would argue the most misunderstood phrase in this entire chapter.
Oh, I know exactly where you're going.
Verses 22 to 25, they discuss this chaotic scenario where men are fighting and they accidentally strike a pregnant woman, causing a premature birth or serious injury.
Right.
And this is where we get the famous eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot.
Yes.
No, I have to ask, looking at this objectively, isn't this just a divine license for brutal, bloody revenge?
It is incredibly easy to read it that way, especially through a modern lens.
Right, it sounds barbaric.
But when we look at the historical and textual context, the lex talionis, the law of retaliation, was actually engineered as a strict limitation on violence.
Wait, really? A limitation?
Yes. If we connect this to the bigger picture, think back to the broader biblical narrative in Genesis, specifically to a character named Lamech.
Okay, Lamech.
Lamech boasted that if a man merely bruised him, he would kill the man.
Oh, wow.
If someone wounded him, he would exact revenge 77 times over.
That's a bit of an overreaction.
Exactly. But that was the human default in these tribal societies. Escalating, disproportionate, unchecked blood feuds. The mentality of, you stole my sheep, so I will burn down your entire village.
Ah, I see. So eye for an eye is essentially establishing a ceiling on vengeance. It's saying only an eye for an eye and absolutely no more. The punishment must precisely fit the crime, but it is legally forbidden to exceed it.
Precisely. It demanded proportional justice. It took the punishment out of the hands of angry, volatile victims and placed it into a cold judicial system of equal compensation.
That makes so much sense.
And the NLA notes emphasize that this principle was deeply rooted in the belief that humanity was made in the image of God.
Right?
Therefore, human life and human bodies have a specific intrinsic value that must be accounted for fairly without escalating into generational warfare.
And we know from other historical texts that this wasn't always carried out literally, right?
Not always.
It often translated to the financial value of an eye for the value of an eye.
Right, monetary compensation.
But the most fascinating application of this bodily protection involves the servants again.
Yes.
The text says that if a master hits his male or female servant and knocks out their eye, the servant goes free. In fact, if he just knocks out their tooth, the servant goes free. My question is, why a tooth? An eye is a major sensory organ, obviously, but a tooth is a relatively minor injury.
It's really about the anthropological significance of the threshold.
Okay.
The law dictates that the very moment a master abuses his power and causes permanent physical damage, even something as minor as a single dental unit, the economic contract is entirely voided.
Wow.
The servant is instantly emancipated. The Holman Bible notes point out that this level of protection for servants against physical abuse was practically non-existent in other ancient legal codes.
Where they were just seen as property.
Right. In other cultures, masters could often kill servants with little to no penalty. So this is a radical structural check on power.
So we've explored how humans are held strictly liable for their own violence, whether it's an economic brawl, a premeditated murder, or abusing an employee.
Yeah.
But nature doesn't really care about human laws, which brings up a bizarre edge case in this text. Criminal animals. What happens when nature or someone's property causes the violence? This brings us to the final segment of chapter 21, verses 28 through 36.
The famous and highly detailed laws of the goring ox.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This section reads perfectly like modern liability law.
It really does.
Because in an agrarian society, an ox isn't a pet. It's a multi-million-dollar piece of ancient, heavy machinery. It's the tractor that runs your entire farm.
Exactly.
So the law says that if an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox must be stoned to death and its meat cannot be eaten. But the owner of the ox is considered innocent.
Right.
Now, I have a major question about the economics here. If the owner did nothing wrong, if it was just a freak accident, why destroy the meat?
Yeah, it seems incredibly wasteful.
Right. In a subsistence economy, throwing away 1,000 pounds of beef is a massive, devastating financial loss. Why let all that food go to waste?
It is a staggering economic loss.
Yeah.
But the mechanism behind that rule is deeply tied to the biblical worldview of the sanctity of life, tracing back to Genesis chapter 9. Human life is sacred because it bears the image of the divine. So when an animal kills a human, the text views that animal as having incurred blood guilt.
I see.
It is fundamentally tainted by the taking of a human life.
So by consuming its meat, the community would essentially be participating in that blood guilt.
Exactly. The stoning of the ox isn't just waste, it is a communal execution. It's this loud, societal declaration that human life is infinitely more valuable than any amount of property, labor, or food.
Wow.
You simply cannot profit from an animal that has killed a human.
But the law draws a massive, heavy line when it comes to gross negligence.
Oh, yes.
The text says, what if the ox had a history of goring? What if it was a known, documented threat, the owner was explicitly warned, and he still failed to lock it up?
Right.
If that ox gets loose and kills someone, the ox is stoned, and the owner is put to death.
Because the causality has entirely shifted. At that point, it's no longer an unforeseeable tragic accident. It is criminal negligence.
Yeah.
By willfully ignoring a known deadly risk, the owner's inaction essentially becomes the murder weapon. He becomes morally and legally responsible for the resulting death.
The text does offer a pragmatic economic equation for this, though. It says the victim's family can demand a ransom for the owner's life.
Yes.
So he can pay a heavy fine instead of being executed. And there's a specific price listed. If the ox kills a servant, the owner pays the servant's master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox is still stoned.
Which, again, shows the sophisticated pragmatism interwoven with the moral law.
Definitely.
As the Holman notes highlight, these laws are constantly balancing the absolute sacredness of life with a practical, daily need to compensate for lost property and lost labor in a functioning economy.
And that economic pragmatism gets incredibly specific. The text covers what happens if you dig a pit and leave it uncovered, and your neighbor's donkey falls in and dies.
Yes.
You have to pay the neighbor the value of the donkey, but you get to keep the dead animal. I actually had to think about the economic causality of that for a second to realize how brilliant it is.
Walk us through the math of it.
Okay, let's say you buy a live donkey for 100 pieces of silver.
Right.
It falls into my uncovered pit and dies. The dead carcass is worth maybe, I don't know, 10 pieces of silver for the hide and meat.
Yeah, a fraction of the cost.
Under this law, I, the pit owner, have to pay you the full 100 pieces of silver, but I get to keep the carcass.
All right.
Why? Because it prevents an unearned economic windfall. You get your 100 silver back so you can buy a new live donkey. You are made entirely whole.
Right, you haven't lost anything.
Exactly. Meanwhile, I am penalized by effectively being forced to buy a dead donkey at full retail price. Nobody gets rich, but the victim is perfectly restored.
It is a brilliantly calibrated system. It requires the community to parse out intent, historical behavior, and exact economic burden, all without creating incentives for fraud.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? Why should you care about ancient oxen, uncovered pits, and ear piercings at a doorpost?
Yeah, why does it matter?
Because you are looking at the foundational logic of the justice system you live under today. The concept of suing for lost wages and medical bills. The principle of proportional punishment ensuring the penalty actually fits the crime.
Exactly.
The idea that an employer cannot physically abuse someone without severe legal consequence. The fundamental, unshakable sanctity of human life. It's not just ancient history. It's literally the DNA of our modern civil rights.
It reminds us that humanity struggled to balance justice, economics, and compassion.
Yeah.
It isn't some modern invention.
Right.
They were wrestling with the exact same complex variables we do. They were just applying them to an agricultural setting.
Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with today. A little thought experiment for you to mull over on your own.
Okay.
We just looked at how strictly this ancient society defined the liability of an owner who fails to control a goring ox. a known predictable danger that is left unsecured.
Right.
So in our hyper-connected world today, what is our modern goring ox? Is it a rogue AI system? Is it a fleet of autonomous cars with faulty sensors?
Oh, that's a good question.
Or is it a toxic social media algorithm that developers know is causing psychological harm, but they fail to put a fence around it because it's just too profitable?
Wow. Yeah.
How do we take these ancient, time-tested principles of protecting the vulnerable, demanding proportional justice, and holding the negligent accountable, and apply them to our cutting-edge, rapidly changing world?
The setting has certainly changed from dirt roads and livestock to, fiber optics and code, but the moral imperative behind the law remains exactly the same.
It really does. Well, thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us today into the legal mechanics of Exodus 21.
It's been great.
And as we sign off, I want to say it clearly and joyfully. God blesses all the listeners. Have an absolutely wonderful week, and we will catch you next time.